Okay, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where we're finding you. And welcome to the United States Institute of Peace virtual conversation. My name is Dan Markey. I'm a senior advisor with the South Asia program at USIP. And it's a real pleasure today to be able to introduce the two authors, the co-authors of a recent USIP report, and to be able to host a conversation with them about the contents of that report and its implications. Now, our plan today is to have a moderated conversation at the outset, and then eventually we'll open the floor to your questions from the audience. And so I just wanted to flag that from the outset, that for those of us who are joining us virtually, you can do so on a variety of different platforms. But if you wish to ask a question, the best way to do that is through usip.org, where you'll be able to find a question function. You can just type it in, and that way it'll get to me so that I can pose it to our two authors. What I'd like to begin by doing, of course, is to introduce our two authors, and they are on the screen with me now. The first is Mubashar Hasan. He is an adjunct research fellow in the Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative at the School of Social Science and Psychology in the University of Western Sydney. He's the author of the book Islam and Politics in Bangladesh, published in 2020, and the co-editor of the book Radicalization in South Asia, published in 2019. He's a member of the Research Advisory Council at the Resolve Network and formerly a Resolve Network Fellow in Bangladesh in 2017. He worked as a researcher at the University of Oslo, Norway from 2018 to 2020, and taught political science and journalism in Bangladeshi universities. In 2022, Griffith Business School at Griffith University in Australia awarded Mubashar with an Outstanding International Alumnus Award for his works on democracy and human rights in Bangladesh. He holds a PhD from Griffith University in Australia. So he's our first author. Our second author is Geoffrey Macdonald. He's a senior advisor for Asia and Bangladesh at the International Republican Institute. And he is, from 2018 to 2022, he was IRI's Bangladesh country director, where he oversaw IRI's programs on countering violent extremism and other democracy and governance issues. He lived in Dhaka from 2019 to 2021, and continues to travel to Bangladesh regularly. He's written over a dozen articles, reports, and book chapters on Bangladesh, which have been published by Foreign Policy, the Council on Foreign Relations, the U.S. Institute of Peace, of course, and other academic and policy outlets. He holds a PhD from the University of Denver and has taught political science at Grinnell College, George Washington University, and elsewhere. So obviously we have two tremendous experts on the topic here. And the specific issue that we'll be focusing on, of course, is the persistent challenge of extremism in Bangladesh. And you can access not only this video, but also the report itself on the USIP website. And I would certainly commend it to you as a great place to learn more about this issue. But for now, we're gonna dive right in. I'm gonna kick it off with a question for Geoffrey, a general question. You know, this report looks at the topic of extremism in Bangladesh. And I guess one good place to start would be to ask how you actually define extremism and how your report tries to frame that issue.
Thanks, Dan, and good morning, good evening to those watching today. I think to frame our report, Mubashar and I wanted to critically assess this narrative in Bangladesh as a country that essentially has extremism under control, right, in recent years. And look, of course, in some sense, this is certainly true. Terrorism is down precipitously in Bangladesh since the Holey Artisan attack. The audience is probably familiar with the Holey Artisan attack in July of 2016. 5 militants stormed a cafe in the diplomatic zone of downtown Dhaka executed 20 hostages. It was in a long standoff. It was a quite spectacular attack that I think shocked a lot of international observers, and I think kind of shook a lot of the domestic policymakers in Bangladesh. And since that point, we've seen a real decline in terrorist attacks and deaths due to terrorism. And this is certainly due in part to effective state action and a lot of international attention and funding. But since that point, we've seen attention wane on this issue. And so we felt that this narrative about kind of Bangladesh having kind of controlled this is kind of conflating extremism and terrorism in a way that obscures other types of violence, behavior, of beliefs that kind of might share some of the maybe ideological correlates of Islamist extremism that drove the Holey Artisan attack. And these are kind of violence against LGBTQ people, Ahmadiyya, Hindu minority, atheists, and others. And so we wanted to examine this issue with a broader lens. And I'll take just a minute more to talk about what that lens was. And so we structured this report around a spectrum of religious extremism, essentially defined by its level of militancy. So we got, on the one end, religiously inspired or grounded illiberalism that's often held by many ordinary citizens in Bangladesh. This can include intolerant or violent attitudes towards the LGBTQ community, religious minorities, other minority groups. These attitudes often don't necessarily result in violence unless there's a specific incident that provokes it, or you see elite manipulation on the issue. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got violent extremist organizations like ISIS, AQIS, which continue to advocate and employ violence to support an Islamic political and social agenda in Bangladesh. And then in the middle, you've got these organized Islamist groups that are certainly illiberal, and advocate a strict form of Islamic governance, but typically do not openly promote violence. And so you've got this spectrum, which, of organizations or ideas that share this illiberal and exclusionary interpretation of Islam, but have differing degrees of ideological coherence and willingness to use violence. And so we thought this spectrum, which we use in the report, better captures this challenge of religious extremism in Bangladesh. And of course, we always have to use the caveat here that religious extremism inherent to Islam or unique to Islam. But as a Muslim majority country, Islamist extremism is the most prevalent and consequential form of religious extremism. So it's the focus of our report.
Oh, that's great. And a great way to kick things off in terms of framing the various issues and how at some level they're interconnected. I want to get into that a little bit more. But let me push it over to Mubashar now and get a different aspect of the framing of the report. Because, in this report, it's clear that there are some complicated relationships between a series of different ideas. You've got Islam, as Geoffrey was just talking about, not necessarily a driver, but is certainly implicated in these questions. You've got secularism, which is a critical part of Bangladesh's political history. You've got just outright politics in the normal sense of contestation for power, and you have violence. Which is obviously the thing that worries us in some ways the most. So I'd like you to at least pick a piece of this, and maybe you can focus on the relationship between religion and secularism in Bangladesh, and how that relates to this question of Islamic militancy within that environment, which doesn't make Bangladesh unique, but certainly is a bit different from other societies, and it's worth thinking about it in its own context.
Thanks, Dan. It's a great question. I think when we talk about religion and secularism in Bangladesh, it's complicated, and there is no clear-cut dichotomy between these two concepts in the country. So in Bangladesh, there are people, and in political spectrum, religion is translated as a pluralist idea, which is in many ways true in many contexts. And also secularism was translated as a religious idea that is that protects people from all faiths and promotes religious harmony. So we could see that this lack of clear-cut dichotomy makes the issue of Bangladesh and the analysis on Bangladesh quite tough to decipher that what's really going on and where is the boundary between religion and secularism. And I think what Geoffrey and I try to unpack in our report is that there are many meanings of religion and secularism, and they kind of overlaps in political spectrums. And when we put those concepts in relation to Islamic militancy and violence, we also need to remember that in Bangladesh, political violence and state violence both are quite prevalent, and we're looking at an issue that is part of, in many ways, part of cultural production. When you say cultural production, it means that there are religious violence, there are even secular violence to some extent. And within this context, there are many groups that we laid out in our report quite clearly that promotes particular worldview, and they're also connected with the geopolitical evolution of Islamist militants.
Again, if I can follow up just with a question to get a little bit more into just this sort of at a definitional level and a historical level, what is secularism in Bangladesh? Because different societies, in a sense, have same word but different practical meanings, and I'd be curious to better understand it in the Bangladeshi case.
So there are when we talk about secularism in Bangladesh, we need to be mindful that there are two levels of interpretation. One is from the society level, where there are secular activists and groups, and another is from the political and state platforms. And I have seen in my research and through our report as well that in political spectrum, secularism does not exclude religion. The current Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasan, has publicly mentioned many times that secularism is part of Islam. And that promotes religious harmony. And if we go back to the beginning of the history of the emancipation of Bangladesh, even then, even though it was a constitutionally secular state, there are many religious policies being taken. And I think if we want to define political secularism in Bangladesh, perhaps the current constitutional notion explains it better, which is it is a constitutionally secular country, but the state has a religion, that is Islam. And many people who don't really find it difficult to decipher, but once they would delve into the history, I think it would make more sense. But that is different from the societal explanation of secularism, especially when you talk about secular activists and so forth.
Right. So at a political level, secularism in Bangladesh doesn't mean the absence of religious faith. In fact, it means the presence of a vision, but one that's supposed to create space for different faiths. But it does so through a religious lens, which one could be forgiven for finding that a bit complicated, but it's an important thing to understand. Let's move on. This report looks at the state of contemporary extremist attitudes and violence, as Geoffrey, you pointed out, since that horrific 2016 terrorist attack. And it looks at four kinds of extremism. So it looks at violent extremism, extremist organizations, or shorthand VEOs. It looks at LGBTQ attacks. It looks at attacks on non-Muslims. and it looks at attacks on Muslim minorities and secularists. So I wonder if you could at least pick a couple of these and give us a little bit more flavor and detail. So maybe the VEO story and the LGBTQ attacks, if you're willing. What's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these two types of violence that you cited here, kind of the VEOs, kind of extremist organizations, and the LGBTQ attacks are kind of on either end of our spectrum in some ways that I laid out at the beginning. And so I can start with the violent extremist organizations. And so what we're seeing again over the past now, 6 years or so, right, since the Holey Artisan attack, there has been a clear decline in incidents of terrorism and deaths due to those incidents. Still, you do see the presence of transnational, regional, domestic extremist groups that continue to operate and recruit in, or at least want to operate and recruit in Bangladesh. On the transnational front, though much diminished, right, in recent years, right, ISIS has released Bangla language propaganda. They apparently nominated some sort of Bengali emir, right, to kind of oversee its operations in Bangladesh. And you've seen ISIS recruitment in Bangladesh focus in on the kind of what they cite as the kind of the oppressive nature of the government, that parties are insufficiently Muslim, that there's too much Western and non-Muslim influence. And ISIS is taking credit for recent, I think it was in 2019, a series of small-scale kind of bomb attacks on police. And ISIS took credit for those attacks, and the trial for the Holey Artisan attackers. One of the attackers came out of the courthouse and was wearing an ISIS cap, right? And it was very much shocking to those watching, right? And it demonstrated a continued, at least social influence of these sorts of transnational terrorist groups. You then have the regional terrorist groups, right? AQIS, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent is probably the most prominent. They have been implicated in blogger murders and other kinds of violence over the past decade. They continue to recruit online with similar messages to what we see ISIS using about Indian and Hindu influence in the country, a government that's insufficiently Muslim and religious, and that women are inappropriate leaders is another component of their messaging. And of course, Bangladesh has been led by almost consecutive women leaders since 1991. And then you have a series of domestic groups, right, like Neo-JMB, ABT, a lot of acronyms here of these smaller groups that have at least nominal affiliations with those bigger kind of regional and transnational movements. And so, while we have seen this decline in terrorist attacks, we do see the persistence of these organizations. We don't want to overstate this problem, right? I think the scope and reach of these groups is not entirely clear, but they certainly have an undeniable presence online. We continue to see that type of recruitment, and we're seeing Bangladeshi police security forces arrest people who are affiliated with these organizations on the ground. So they're clearly still there, and it's still an issue, right? And so that, on our kind of spectrum, is a kind of one side of that sort of the kind of militant Islamism. On the other side, which again has some relation certainly to it, is the sort of extremism targeting the LGBTQ community. Now, this is a type of extremism that has been perpetrated by some of these extremist organizations that I just laid out. I think it is more often than not, though, takes the form of nonviolent harassment or non-life-threatening violence targeting LGBTQ individuals. Right? So you had in 2016 the high-profile murders of two LGBTQ activists, Rohan Manan and Tanoy Mahbub, which were big, right, international events, right, kind of got a lot of attention. Since that point, these sorts of high-profile murders of LGBTQ activists have declined, due probably at least in part to effective state action, but also just LGBTQ activism has gone underground, right? There's been, you have a real movement away from any kind of public advocacy on this issue. And there's, research that I've worked on at IRI has shown a lot of this. We conducted a snowball sample survey and a focus group study of the LGBTQ community in Bangladesh, which show this kind of persistent and routine violence, harassment, social ostracism, racism in the community. This includes within the family, sexual violence from strangers, from the police, discrimination in housing, jobs, medical care, and elsewhere. And in these studies, the participants cite an illiberal interpretation of Islam as one of the key drivers of this violence and discrimination. In another study, we did a content analysis of online commentary around this incident that occurred in 2020, where a former of this online education firm posted a pro-LGBTQ comment on his Facebook page, his personal Facebook page, and he immediately started to receive death threats, and the company itself was targeted, and the employees that worked for the company received death threats. And so what we did was do a kind of a content analysis of some of the online commentary on this issue, right, on YouTube videos or Facebook posts. And we found, kind of unsurprisingly, is that a lot of these comments and posts, right, were kind of grounded in a kind of religious prohibitions on same-sex intercourse, right, and LGBTQ individuals. And so overall, while these anti-LGBTQ attitudes in Bangladesh typically, though not always, certainly produce less, I think, deadly violence than the explicitly violent belief systems of these extremist organizations that I discussed earlier, these anti-LGBTQ attitudes are certainly, they're more widespread, they're no doubt impact more people, and they share a lot of the ideological underpinnings of these organizations, these more explicitly extremist organizations, which is why it's on the sort of spectrum of extremism that we wanted to discuss in the paper.
Thanks, Geoffrey. That's a really great way to characterize again, this spectrum of attitudes. You're starting with a sort of highly organized and extremely militant with clear connections to violence on the one hand, and then the other hand, a kind of a diffuse societal potential for violent views, but with lacking that organization. And so just a quick follow-up on that. Actually, I have a couple of questions there. One is, you made the point that there are kind of ideological underpinnings that link these two. But why, maybe this takes you back to your first argument, why see them as like or interconnected? In other words, could you have one without the other? Do the highly organized, really violent, maybe most dangerous groups swim in the societal sea of these illiberal attitudes? In other words, do they give them sustenance? Or are they basically just operating kind of in parallel? How do you actually see the connections between the two ends of the spectrum, other than purely on the basis of kind of ideas underlying them?
I would say I think they, to use your terminology, kind of swim in this kind of sea of social illiberalism, and probably can pull from it and grow within it, but also inflame it, right? And so I don't think it's certainly not a coincidence that many of these extremist organizations have explicitly targeted and murdered LGBTQ activists, right? So it's very much part of the overall ideology. Now, I think anti-LGBTQ beliefs are probably widely held in Bangladesh. It doesn't mean these people are necessarily are going to run over to these extremist organizations. I think that's, of course, not the case, right? But it demonstrates, I think, a kind of social raw material that these sort of extremist organizations can pull from, and then their attacks, their rhetoric, their online recruitment inflames some of those social attitudes, and it normalizes it in a variety of ways. So I think they're related in kind of an ideational way, but it's a kind of, I think, a complicated and almost reciprocal relationship between the sort of social conservatism that exists and then the organized extremism that can draw on it, but also inflame it.
That's really helpful. I guess one other but more specific question is that if I'm not mistaken, in the report, there was an observation that the government seemed to be downplaying this kind of spectrum of attitudes or concerns, especially about the high-end groups like ISIS. Did I get that right? Is that correct? And why would that be? I wasn't clear on that.
Sure. I think the concern on the part of the Awami League government is, post Holey Artisan, you had a kind of evaporation of economic activity. You had embassies started treating it as a high security post. You had companies pulling out, right? And so this hurt the country economically. It also hurt the general reputation of the country as a country of some kind of syncretic and liberal interpretations of the religion. And so I think that the Awami League government, but probably any government that was in power, right? If it was a different government, probably would have been doing the same thing, has, I think, been wary of kind of overstating these connections, right? That they want to say these are domestic groups that are kind of coming out. The terrorist groups are kind of domestic organizations that we can control ourselves. These are not linked to these bigger international issues, right? And by also keeping it as domestic, as terrorism as a domestic problem, it can be linked up to domestic politics, which is also to the advantage of the ruling party. So there are Islamist movements in the country, opposition parties, right? And when you kind of ground it in domestic issues, you can more effectively infuse politics into it. If it's a problem that's emanating from outside of the country, it's harder to make it political, and it's also harder to control. So I think the government has downplayed this connection, but to me, the connection seemed quite clear that ISIS, AQIS, these organizations have some degree of operations either online or on the ground in the country, despite many of these denials, which I think is well documented in the media and other reports.
Great, thank you. Very helpful. Mubashar, let me come back to you now. There were these other, so we had 4 categories of extremism, and Geoffrey's talked about 2 of them. I wonder if you could pick up on some of the others, this violence against non-Muslims in Bangladesh and violence against Muslim minorities and secularists.
No, I mean, this has been a persistent problem since 2013. We have seen that there was every year there were targeted attack on religious minorities. They are Hindus, they are Buddhist, and also some Sufi Muslims as well, who are proclaimed as non-Muslim by more hardline Islamists. And this issue has been a recurrent theme, and the degree varies year to year. I think there was and also atheists were the target of the militant attack. And over 40 of killing that happened between 2013 and 2016 in Bangladesh, and they were by highly organized militant attack. And there were, in the media, there were reports that there was a hit list, and these people were being targeted. Many of them were slain. And the issue of Hindus, the issue of attack against the Hindus has been persistent, and also the Buddhist. And with the evolution of Facebook and the widespread use of Facebook, Facebook became a medium of what is the best way to put it? Medium of promoting religious hatred against religious minorities, and it is becoming a problem. And as I said, the degree varies year to year. But against the backdrop of international pressure and much reporting, it seems to be quite down at the moment. But the mentality persists. And another complicated thing about these attacks is that many of them could be not religiously motivated while using this religious violence phase. Many of them could be to overtake their homes, their properties, and those sort of stuff. And in Bangladesh, land grabbing of political opposition is part of political culture. I'm not downplaying by any way that the problem persists. What I'm saying that it is difficult to disassociate which one is religiously motivated attack and which are not religiously motivated attack. Even an attack which is not religiously motivated attack would use the camouflage of religious violence.
Thank you. Very helpful. And a couple of things threads I want to pursue with you a little further. Before I do that, I did want to remind our online audience that if you have questions, you can put them in the question box on usip.org if you're watching us through that. But again, let me pick up just at least one piece of this, because you mentioned Facebook, and this is a problem not just in Bangladesh but elsewhere in terms of the connections between social media and mobilization of violence within societies. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say a little bit more about how that has actually worked, and what, if anything, anyone, including Facebook itself, has done or might do to address that one specific piece of the puzzle.
I think I would answer part, and it would be great if Geoffrey joins in, because we both co-written an article for the Foreign Policy magazine on this about how Facebook fuels religious violence. So the part I want to focus on is the pattern of the attacks on Facebook based on Facebook posts were persistent. It's just someone would create fake Facebook post, and in that Facebook post, there will be message that someone who is from religious minority background hurt or dishonored the Muslim prophet and God, and with that messaging, they would mobilize the local people, and then they will attack. And this has been the way many religious attacks took place in Bangladesh against the minorities. Maybe Geoffrey could jump in with our finding on how Facebook now addressing this problem.
Yeah, that'd be great, Geoffrey.
Sure. I should first say, I think I'm not a tech specialist, but I can give my kind of understanding. When a lot of this stuff has been public, there's been a long-standing kind of, I think, debate between Facebook and its critics now for years at this point. I think what Facebook says is they are trying to hire more, as Mubashar said, right? So you have explicit hate speech, some of it fake, almost designed deliberately to provoke these sorts of attacks, it seems, right? And it's being put on Facebook, and Facebook is kind of a platform to provoke these sorts of attacks. You don't need Facebook for this type of violence, but we're seeing Facebook playing an increasingly common role in this type of violence. So how do you control it? Facebook is saying they're hiring more kind of Bangla language specialists to be reviewing this. They're tweaking their algorithms. But it just, quite honestly, just doesn't seem to be working, right? I mean, and maybe it is diminishing, and it's hard to know the counterfactual, right, of what it's taking down and how much it's able to control overall. But we're seeing it's essentially an annual recurrence here of this type of social media driven violence. In fact, we're about the kind of the anniversary year, because it's Durga Puja, right? Of a year ago, you had these large scale Hindu riots that were provoked by a fake Facebook post. There was a video that was clearly deliberately fake that was made to provoke this sort of violence. So I think not being a tech specialist, I would say, I think what we're interested in Facebook doing more, or maybe enhancing its efforts to control this sort of rhetoric online and limiting its spread, right? It's hard to prevent it from going online, but you can limit its gets spread, right? How many times it's shared, how many likes it gets, how long it lasts online. And the offending videos from a year ago, if I remember correctly, were online for 3 days. And you can double check me on that, but for an extended period, I think it was 3 days, right? Online, right? Being shared, provoking this sort of violence before Facebook took it down. So it's an extraordinarily difficult challenge to address, no doubt. I mean, the Facebook as a communications platform is just difficult to control. But it seems clear that more needs to be done to prevent this type of hate speech, fake rhetoric that's being designed to exacerbate this sort of violence.
Interesting. Well, this raises a lot of questions about policy options and policy directions. I want to get to those in a minute. I do want to make sure that we get to the heart of the matter, which is, I'm going to come back to Mubashar. Why does this continue to be such a problem? I mean, the two of you have done a fantastic job kind of sketching out the categories of the problem. And systematically reviewing it and giving us reasons to be worried that it does persist. But what are the factors that lay this out? I think the report sets out 5 of them. Some of them are longstanding, some of them are new. One is the influence of Islamist socio-political movements. So I wonder, if you can unpack that, what an Islamist socio-political movement, what you mean by that, and what work it's doing in your analysis.
So Islamist socio-political movements means there are illiberal religious forces in the society who are organized and who are pursuing and advancing at least until 2018, vigorously they were pursuing agendas like secular and atheist authors should face capital punishment. There would be no mixing between men and women in the public, and so forth. So that is based on the Islamic seminaries and an organization called Hefazat-e-Islam that who pursued it, and their root, many people finds their root in 2008-13, but they are deeply rooted, and their root could be traced back to the British colonial period. So they are deeply rooted into the society. So that is a platform that advances illiberal values, and then there are more formal Islamist parties who also support these illiberal values. And if you see the target of who were the target in from 2013 to 2016, they were the secular atheist writers, bloggers, publishers, Sufi Muslims, non-Muslims, and so forth. And if you see that there is a correlation between the demand of this Islamist socio-political movement, who do want them to be tried legally, but at the same time, what they do is that they popularize this idea that they are enemy of religion. And within the popularized idea, that means that it gets some fuel, and which are then are recruited by the militant organization and execute those things. So that's the way at least it worked in the past decade. And also the problem of the counterpart, the secular. When we say secular, so we're not really talking about the liberal force. It's also illiberal in many ways. So within this illiberal political, socio-cultural practice, more organized militant groups took advantage.
Very important. Okay, thank you. So that gives us a kind of a window into features of Bangladeshi society and politics, some of which are actually deeply rooted, as you say, and quite long-standing. I mean, go back to pre-independence time frame. Geoffrey, if I can switch over to you, there are aspects that are also new and different. So the story is evolving, and some of these are quite new. The report points to COVID-19 as a perhaps an exacerbating factor, but also regional politics. And I wonder if you could pick one of these. I'm actually quite interested in the regional politics angle, how Bangladesh's neighbors and what's happening with them may be affecting what's happening inside of Bangladesh on these issues.
Sure, happy to, and I'll focus on the regional politics, and we can come back to COVID if there are questions on that. So, I think when we think about how regional politics is exacerbating this challenge of extremism, there are, I think, three key countries to look at. You got to look at India, you look at Myanmar, and you look at Afghanistan, right? India probably has the outsized influence here as the big neighbor. I think what we've seen under the BJP is a rise in rhetoric and policies that are widely perceived in Bangladesh, if not kind of explicitly seen as anti-Muslim, right? The citizenship registry in Assam, the Citizenship Amendment Act. There have been border killings of Bangladeshis on the border, right? A lot of this is kind of ramping up, right, anti-Indian sentiment, right, that I think at least anecdotally appears to be growing. And there's not great survey data on this question, but I've been working on Bangladesh for close to a decade. I think you hear on the street at the elite level far more criticism of India than I've seen, right? I think it's been building over time, kind of reaching a peak at this point. And I think what we saw, demonstrated by the protests in 2021 around Narendra Modi's visit to Dhaka, you had large-scale protests. Hafazat led many of them, right? Mubashar discussed Hafazat, but there were also conservative madrasas. You had leftists also protesting, right? So it's a diverse movement here that's quite critical of India, right? And because anti-Hindu and anti-Indian sentiment are seen in the rhetoric of these extremist organizations, right? You see it online. You see ISIS, AQIS, these other extremist organizations talking about how Indian influence, Hindu influence is bad for Bangladesh. When you see the masses also moving to that view, it kind of feeds this dynamic. And so you have kind of anti-Muslim actions in India pushing this dynamic of extremism in Bangladesh. On Myanmar, I think the actions of Myanmar on targeting the Muslim Rohingya community also feeds extremism, right? And probably in two key ways. One, it can provoke anti-Buddhist action and sentiment in the border regions, right? And I've done research in these border regions in Buddhist communities that have been targeted by kind of Islamist and Jamaat led violence in those areas. And they'll say that when you see repression of Muslims across the border, Jamaat, Islamist movements in the local area will use that example to target their community. And so you've seen it spur this type of radicalization. A second way is just the Rohingya camps themselves have become focal points of potential radicalization, at least, right? So you're seeing kind of Islamist groups like ARSA in the Rohingya community becoming more powerful. Islamist Bangladeshi groups are providing a lot of aid and support and are quite popular in the camps. We don't want to overstate this threat and present refugees as kind of inherent threat, because they're certainly not. But research in the camps, including my own research in the camps, I think there is concern, even among Rohingya themselves, about the influence of kind of Islamist movements and radicalization there, right? So you're seeing like the Myanmar action inflaming the problem. Finally, Afghanistan, right, which is a much more contemporary issue. I mean, I guess they're all contemporary, but Afghanistan, we're talking about the Taliban takeover, so quite recent, right? And there's a lot of concern that the Taliban victory has the potential to embolden terrorism. There are reports that at least a handful of Bangladeshis went to Afghanistan to kind of join the Taliban's fight against the government there. After the victory, there's a lot of analysis of social media in Bangladesh that showed widespread celebration and praise of the Taliban. So there's concern among security analysts that the Taliban's victory could inspire radicalization. It could encourage militants potentially to go back to Afghanistan for training, which was an issue that Bangladesh saw in the 80s. It could revive some of the support for domestic groups, which seemed to be not quite dormant, but contained relatively well, and potentially embolden some of these extremist groups to ramp up their recruitment, right? And so you're seeing all of these kind of regional dynamics, kind of what happens domestically in these countries is feeding into a dynamic of extremism in Bangladesh. It's hard for the Bangladesh government to control. It's just something that is occurring largely it's outside of their borders, and in ways that they can't. They have limited kind of levers to control these sorts of issues.
Thank you. Yeah, an incredibly difficult neighborhood. One could imagine sticking Bangladesh someplace else on the world map where it wouldn't have so many of these transnational factors to have to grapple with. Listen, we're getting a lot of great questions coming in, and I want to give some time to those. I do want to remind our audience that if you want to ask questions, you can put them in on usip.org. There is a question function there. Mubashar, I was going to ask you this anyway, but some of our questioners have already gotten to it. They're trying to draw the connection between the state of democracy in Bangladesh and some of these outcomes. And, so here we have, let's see if I can pull up one, questions about the concentration of power in the Awami League, a shift in alliance with Islamist politicians and actors towards the Awami League. So some of the features within democratic politics and specifically party politics, but also if you wouldn't mind commenting on the broader state of democracy and how that relates to these problems, I think that would be useful.
No, that's a great question. I think to understand Bangladesh, one should look into the vast number of youths in the country. A majority of Bangladeshis now are born after 1971. So it gives an understanding that it's a country full of young people, and it's a natural tendency of the youth to enjoy freedom if they are not grown up in a highly authoritarian dictatorial country, which Bangladesh was not. And then, so there is a direct, in many ways, there are some correlation between the persistent authoritarianism, human rights violation, and people are not being able to express politically within the bound of law. So I think it's a paramount importance that there should be more to support political pluralism and democracy in Bangladesh. The country hasn't seen any free and fair elections since 2008, and most of the talks we talk about in our report happened within the past decade, and that says a lot without saying things explicitly, I think.
Yeah, so the closing of political space you're pointing out is not just, I mean, it's an immediate problem or a problem that's been going on for the past decade, but it is also a kind of a deeper problem in terms of what the expectations of the young Bangladeshis are for their polity, which is really important. So, we've spent a lot of time now talking about all the problems. And that's quite right, because I think a big part of your report is to make sure that readers appreciate that even if the sort of absolute level of violence may be down in certain ways, the underlying problems, as you put it, do persist. But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some potential solutions or partial solutions or policy recommendations that the report brings to bear. So, Geoffrey, you talk about maybe something to do with efforts to promote social pluralism or tolerance, counter online. We already talked about countering online radicalization in a way, or at least the narrow issue of dealing with social media, and maybe also something to do with interreligious relations. That might be an area where you can address to kick things off.
Sure, happy to. And I think we propose in the report some high-level recommendations that no doubt are building on existing approaches to PCV that we kind of are preventing and countering violent extremism that should be expanded. I think we could think of these as kind of strategic priorities, many of which already exist that we should kind of build out in these local contexts. And I think part of these recommendations is not necessarily to say that none of this is going on, but some of it might do, but that we should maintain our focus on them, right? In this era, I mean, you've seen a lot of international funding shift elsewhere, a lot of attention shifting elsewhere. And so we think a lot of the attention of what we were doing, what was going on in Bangladesh right after Holey Artisan should still be doing, right? Because a lot of those underlying factors remain, even if we're seeing the kind of level of attacks go down. And so a couple issues that we raise on promoting social pluralism and tolerance, right? We're seeing, as we lay out in the report, a lot of survey data among ordinary Bangladeshis show a lot of illiberal social attitudes that feed some of this kind of domestic social violence targeting LGBTQ individuals or Hindus or atheists, right? Others, right? And so certainly thinking about infusing more liberalism into the public education system, into public messaging on television, on radio, on social media, kind of foster more tolerance, right? And Bangladesh, in many ways, is a remarkably tolerant country. Again, I want to come back to this point of trying not to overstate the problem, but we do see intolerance, right? We see it at the social level, and we see people dying because of it, right? So it is something that needs to be addressed. And I think efforts to promote more tolerance among alternative beliefs, views, identities, lifestyles is an important component of a kind of counter-extremism strategy. In terms of online radicalization, we've seen under COVID, and perhaps can come back to this, that the pandemic has fueled a lot of online radicalization. So you can see counter messaging, preventive messaging to try to blunt the impact of this. There's always a concern around kind of freedom of speech in the online space, right? And there have been issues in Bangladesh around the Digital Security Act, right? I think the state, there is a balance here of certainly the state, researchers, NGOs need to be watching that online space closely for radicalization, but make sure, and it's hard to do, but make sure that boundary of legitimate speech in legitimate criticism, right, of the state or others is maintained, right? That isn't perceived as radicalization as well. And that sort of push and pull always has to be aware of. We have to be aware of. And then finally, the other issue you raised on interreligious kind of harmony across the region, right? As I laid out, across South Asia, we're seeing religious tension kind of within and between these countries rising, that the actions of Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists in one country is kind of spilling over and feeding into kind of destructive political dynamics across the border. Bangladesh has this long history and heritage of pluralism in the country, right? And I think Bangladesh playing a kind of greater role in the region to foster this type of cross-border interreligious dialogue and tolerance. I think despite some of the problems that occur in Bangladesh, it is, I think, well-positioned as a country, given its history, given its record of pluralism and tolerance, to play a leading role in promoting these types of ideas. And so I think I'd like to see the Bangladesh government do more of that, play more of a big diplomatic role on those types of issues.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I want to come back to you in a minute. First, I want to go to Mubashar again, but I want you to think about, because most of those recommendations are directed really toward the government of Bangladesh. And a lot of our questions that were coming in right now have something to do with what outside countries, whether it's the United States or others or international NGOs or other groups might do to more effectively address some of these problems as well. But Mubashar, coming to you, the report makes a point about what it describes as a do no harm approach to counterterrorism. And one of the questioners has asked us, and I think this relates very directly, something about Bangladesh's the government's history of police excess and abuses and anti-terror laws, and about the question of what protections there should be from the use of terrorism as a means to quash dissent and freedom of conscience, especially with no functioning political opposition. So there seems to be this issue of maybe going too far, the state using the goal of counterterrorism to certain political ends. And you make the point that, above all, do no harm. So what do you mean by that? What does that look like?
The do no harm approach means the respect for rule of law. Not politicizing counterterrorism operation, making it as a focus of state security. While nowadays we are seeing terminology as such that information terrorists being used by the government to refer to dissents and critics, and it's really downplays the seriousness of counterterrorism approaches. Second point, I wanted to go back, and then I will come back to the do no harm approach, is that an important point we mentioned in the report is that even though there are wider support for illiberal values, and the 2017 Resolve Network research found that there's a strong support for democracy as well. So while there are support for illiberal values, there are also support for democracy among the Bangladeshis, and they say Sharia or certain some sort of Islamic governance as an alternative to a corrupt government. So one could see and try to, if they try to understand it, there is a saying that legitimate political opposition it will be some sort of antidote to this problem, which goes back to our own analysis, is that opening up the political space. And on the point of this do no harm approach means also is that rule of law, respect for human rights, no politicization of counterterrorism approach, and finally it should increase the credibility of this operation among the community, rather than, as you could see from some of the comments, that their credibility is not that high at the moment. And government also need to be careful about using the word terrorist as information terrorist and those sort of widespread and generalizing this thing. Thanks.
Thank you. It's in some ways that's a tough balancing act, and it raises the question again. I'll come back to Geoffrey. If you wouldn't mind commenting on. So the government of Bangladesh, this government, hasn't taken a number of these steps, even some of the ones that you would recommend or others, and has taken a pretty politicized approach to these problems, as we've already been discussing. So for the rest of us outside of Bangladesh, are there things, say, that the U.S. government might do more effectively, or international NGOs might do to push these issues in ways that would be constructive?
Yeah, I think of course there are, and in some ways, recommendations that we make or others make to the government of Bangladesh can be supported or implemented by NGOs and other types of organizations, right? So, things like promoting pluralism and tolerance. Many NGOs might not have direct access to the education system, but you can support civic education work across the country that promotes these types of values. You can have NGOs doing online counter-radicalization, and many do. The United Nations UNDP has done this sort of work. My organization, IRI, has done this type of work of online peace messaging, kind of counter and alternative messaging online, done to try to counter radical views. On promoting democracy and pluralism, and I think Mubashar was kind of alluding to this, and we've talked a bit about how the narrowing of political space can drive radicalization. There's a role for democracy and governance NGOs to be promoting and encouraging open and fair competition, strength of political parties across the board, to make it just a more vibrant democracy in which all parties are participating and strong, right? And that is a party, that is a type of a political system that can draw people in, right, as opposed to pushing people out, right? And I think we're seeing a political system that's a fair amount of political violence, right, a high degree of polarization, and it's pushing people out. And the more it pushes people out, the more likely I think we are to see radicalization. And so I think that the government of Bangladesh is aware of these issues, can address them, but no doubt NGOs can support the government of Bangladesh in that and directly implement a lot of these types of programs.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. I did want to just, there was one question about U.S. Bangladesh security cooperation, and that raises the point about how the United States has actually placed sanctions on the RAB, Rapid Action Battalion. Also, on the question of the U.S. not including Bangladesh in the Democracy Summit. I wonder, Mubashar, I don't want to put you on the spot for giving the United States a report card or a grade on its use of these kinds of tools of policy, but do you see ways the United States might use its relationship with Bangladesh effectively to help to address these issues? So not just the NGOs, but the direct U.S. government role.
It seems to me that there are more engagement between the government of both countries after the sanction and the non-invitation to Democracy Summit. And I think it is, in a way, it is increasing, and that also says something about the importance of this relationship between both countries.
So generally a positive outcome from that somewhat critical approach. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
I think that made both governments to engage more. That we could see. Yeah.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, we are at the end of the hour. So this is my time to thank both of you, Mubashar and Geoffrey, for both a great conversation and an excellent report. Again, I commend it to everyone online. Check it out at USIP.org. The title is The Persistent Challenge of Extremism in Bangladesh. Obviously, we'll be doing more work on Bangladesh in the future. And you can also check out the other work that our two authors have done with other institutions. So thanks again to all of you, and we'll look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.